Hello everyone, this is Caly. Welcome to another 5 ways in 5 days video. Today's video is concentrating on 5 ways to use Pawsitively velvet cardstock. We have 3 different sets here. Here are the shades of blue. I just wanted to give you a quick view of what those colors look like in this stack. And then for the classic assortment, we have reds, greens, whites, a taupe, almost brown grayish color, and a black. So it's super helpful to have all these colors. As you can see in my projects, I'll be using all 3 stacks of colors so that you can see how you can use them in a variety of ways. And then finally, for my white sheets, they are sold in half sheets, so I have them stored in half sheet pockets. I love that the cardstock fits snugly inside these pockets, and because of its velvety texture, it kind of holds in place and doesn't slip around. So if I have any smaller pieces, they stay in the pockets really nicely. So I have a quarter-size sheet of the white cardstock in place in my MISTI, and I'm going to show my first technique with some stamping. The stamp set I'm using is called Snowflake Season. It's one of my favorite stamp sets from Simon Says Stamp. So I've used all of the snowflakes to create a background, leaving a little open window to my right where I'm going to be stamping a sentiment later. I have chosen a rainbow of colors, and to blend these colors together, I'm going to use these sponge applicators. And I did stamp directly with my first stamp pad, but for my second pad all the way to the end, I'm going to be using a sponge applicator to apply my ink so that I can get a gradient of colors moving from one color to the next. As you can see, I'm applying that color slowly and overlapping just a little bit between colors to get a smooth transition between the 2 colors, so I'm not getting a sharp line of blues or yellows or greens. The transition between the yellow and the teal is a little bit tougher, but it'll work out okay. And I'll end up stamping this twice just to make sure that I get a crisp image of the colors and a more saturated color. So after I apply my first layer of ink, I'm going to go ahead and stamp my rainbow snowflakes onto that Pawsitively velvet cardstock. And again, because there's texture on the cardstock, my paper isn't going to peel up with the stamp. Often I find that using the magnet doesn't help me when I stamp because the paper always wants to come up with the stamp when I open the door of my MISTI, but because the velvety texture is there, it holds my paper in place and doesn't want to come up with the stamp. So I love that that Pawsitively velvet paper is staying in place and I can stamp a second impression without that paper moving. I'm applying the ink in the very same way, trying to transition the colors a little bit better this time since I can see where the colors are on the stamped image on that cardstock. So I've stamped my second impression and it looks a lot more saturated, and that stamped rainbow is so pretty. It was hard for me to clean off that ink. I really wanted to stamp it over and over again because it was so gorgeous. So here we have a really pretty impression of those rainbow snowflakes on that Pawsitively velvet paper. And as you can see, the paper is pretty flimsy and it doesn't dry right away, so you can always heat set that. When I went to ink blend, which is the second technique that I'm sharing on this Pawsitively velvet paper, I did notice that the ink wasn't exactly dry, so there is some color bleeding, but that's okay. It kind of blends into the blue of the cardstock that I'm blending on it right now. But just be careful if you are to try this at home. I'm learning as I go. I did not try this technique before I started filming, so we are just gonna wing it. But I did want to caution you that the ink does not dry right away on the Pawsitively velvet when you ink blend or stamp on it. So that's why I'm heat setting it now with a heat tool. Anytime I'm drying something and not embossing, I like to use the Ranger Heat It tool. It just applies a lot of heat, but not a lot of air. So I am just running that heat across the panel back and forth until I'm happy with it and think that the ink is dry. Once it's dry, I'm going to go ahead and apply this to a card base so that I can go ahead and work on my next step. Because that cardstock is a little flimsy, like I said, I want to make sure that it's on a card base before I do anything else to it. And before I stamped the sentiment, which you can do in heat set, like I said, am winging it as I go. So we are going to apply sequins first. I'm using a rainbow sequin pack from Simon Says Stamp because it's got lots of different colors in it and I can follow the gradient of the rainbow that's stamped on my card. I'm adding some glue in the center of all of the snowflakes on this card panel and then applying the color sequins that coordinate with the snowflake. And then I decided to stamp the sentiment afterwards. It's totally fine. You can heat set it again if you do it after the fact like I did, but I'm just going to set it aside to dry now that this project is done. So to recap, we've shared 2 ways to use Pawsitively velvet paper. That's stamping and ink blending. Moving on to my second project, I'm going to share 2 more ways to use Pawsitively velvet paper. I'm going to use the Santa Claus die here, and we're going to cut his hat out of velvet cardstock as well as his beard, and I even use some black for his eyes, just to share different ways to use all the different colors of the Pawsitively velvet cardstock that's available. For the blue panel, I'm going to use for my background, and I'm going to dry emboss with it. I have the Swirling Snowflakes embossing folder here, and I think this one is a great one to show you as an example because there are so many details in this, and I want to show you how well it embosses. So I'm going to run this through my die cutting machine, and you're going to see all the details on this Pawsitively velvet paper. I think because the Pawsitively velvet paper is so thin that it transfers all of the embossing really, really well. So we have some really fun texture with that Pawsitively velvet cardstock, but I wanted the snowflake and embossed areas to show even more. So I am lightly dusting the top of the embossed areas with some white pigment ink. So I'm just kind of running my pad across the top there, careful not to press too hard, and then I'll heat set that, learning from my first card that I stamped, knowing this is a pigment ink, so it's going to take a little bit longer to dry. So I'll just heat set that as well as I can, and I'll set that aside, and then I'll die cut all of the Santa Claus pieces so that we can piece this cute Santa together. Okay, so now I'm going to die cut all of the pieces to our Santa Claus wafer die here. Again, I'm going to use Pawsitively velvet paper to die cut his pom-pom, his hat parts, his beard, as well as his eyes. So everything on the left there is Pawsitively velvet paper, and then everything on the right is regular white cardstock. So it's just for the backing and for his face and nose. So I wanted to add some color to the pom-poms and the beard. I always do this and I don't keep things white. So I know that we can ink blend on this, but I thought, what if we use Copics? So this is kind of a little bonus for ways to use Pawsitively velvet cardstock. It's kind of an experiment and I'm glad it worked out, and that's why I didn't officially call this a technique, but it's an extra bonus. So I'm using some very light cardstock colors to add a bit of color and interest to the Santa hat and his beard. So I used some light teal for the pom-pom and the fuzziness of his hat, and a gray tone to add some shading to his beard. Then I'll use Copics on the paper pieces for his face to color the skin of Santa's face and his nose, and then we can piece everything together once this is colored. This die also accompanies some little stars on Santa's face to add some sparkles, so I did die cut that out of matte gold cardstock, so we'll be piecing it all together slowly now. I'm working from the top down, so I started with Santa's hat. I did the pom-pom first, then the hat, then the cuff on his hat, and then there's that little space for the star, so I'm going to go ahead and add that first star in place, and then we'll work on his beard since that connects to his hat, and then I make sure that it all lines up perfectly. I'll pick that up and just kind of shimmy things around, making sure that his face fits in there just perfect, and then I'll attach another little star here. And then his eyes, which I die cut out of that Pawsitively velvet black cardstock. So there's some fun texture there for his eyes as well. So I'll finish off with his nose and beard here, and we have Santa put together. And then we'll finish off with this little star in his beard. And now I'm just gonna dab some little R30 for some cheeks. We can't have Santa not rosy, right? He has to be rosy. Okay, so there is my die cut all pieced together. We have such fun textures on this little guy. And I really love that I was able to put some Copic details on him. I think the shading on his beard and his hat really add some depth to the die cut. So that's a really cool way to use Pawsitively velvet paper as well if you want to add some Copic details with some color on it. I did trim down this background, cutting 1/4 of an inch off all of the sides, and so I'm attaching it again to a card base. I have some 3D foam squares that I attached to the back of Santa's face there, and then I'm going to attach that to the center of my card panel. For a sentiment, I'm going to go easy on this card and use my favorite, a pre-printed sentiment strip. This is the CZ reverse typed Christmas set. I've already trimmed down one that I want to use. I've added some foam squares to the back of that. Now I'm using my T-ruler to make sure it's lined up before I press down onto that velvet background. So we have our second card done. Again, we've embossed as well as used Pawsitively velvet paper to add texture for clothing items and a beard. So that's our two techniques, and the bonus was the Copics. Now for a third card, I wanted to share a few more ways to use Pawsitively velvet cardstock. We're going to use it as snow for a little scene inside that forest border. So I have some white Pawsitively velvet paper that I'm going to die cut and create a little snow slope for grounding for our little village scene. And then I thought it would be fun to use some of the green velvet paper for the foliage on that forest border frame. So I'm going to die cut that now, and you'll see that I also die cut a layer out of a lighter green cardstock just to add some more additional color and interest. And here's a little stitch slope and hills die that I'm going to use to die cut a little hillside for that scene inside that little frame that I want to create. I also die cut a few extra stems and the village houses and trees out of some white glitter cardstock there to my right. So now I'm going to start gluing everything together. I'm going to decide if I want the lighter green on top or the velvet darker green on top. So I decided that it was probably easier for the back of the Pawsitively velvet cardstock to adhere to another cardstock. So I'm using the light green as the back layer. Then I'll use the loose stems that I die cut out of white glitter cardstock here to tuck in between the two layers for some additional color. And it's going to add some sparkle to our frame too because I die cut it out of white glitter cardstock. I tucked in the two leafy stems at the top and bottom. I really should have cut a third stem. I kind of like things in odd numbers. And so anyway, I am trying to balance everything out as best I can. And we have a bunch of these pine sprigs that I'll kind of layer throughout. I did trim them. I thought they were a little bit too long. So I tuck them in wherever I can, spreading them out. And once I have a full frame and I'm happy with it, we can go ahead and create our little snow scene inside that frame. I have that little piece of the hillside and I've positioned it where I want, and I'm going to take my pencil and just outline the inside of that frame. That way I know exactly how much to trim off. I'm going to use a pair of scissors and just trim lightly outside of that pencil line so that I have some space to add some glue so that I can adhere that to the inside of that frame. So I'm adding some little glue lines here, and then I'll use that frame and using that pencil line, lining that up and making sure that it stays in place and is in perfect position. For the background of the little scene I want to create, I trimmed off a piece of cardstock to fit behind the frame, and I'm ink blending it with a blue cardstock. This is Cadet ink, and it is a color that I used for my first snowflake card. So I am just ink blending a sky, so I'm ink blending the top of it very lightly. For the back of these houses, there are little windows that are open, so I am trimming off a few pieces of yellow cardstock and adhering them to the back so they look like light in the houses peeking through the background. And then once I adhere my trees in place and create my little scene, I can go ahead and adhere that blue background to the back of this frame. That really adds structure to the floating houses in our scene too. So that background really helps hold everything in place and further secures our frame. Once our frame is ready to go, I can go ahead and adhere this to a card base. So we have a really pretty card here, and I really wanted to add a bit more texture and shine. So I have some Nouveau glitter here. This is the Gold Coast color. It's going to add some sparkle, and there is shimmers of gold as well as some silver in there. So I think once it dries, it's going to be really gorgeous. But I just go around all of the velvet areas of the greenery and added some of this glitter to the bottom of all of the leaves and as well as on all of the pine branches. So while that's drying, I'm going to prepare another sentiment strip, this time from the Reverse Christmas Wishes set, and I've trimmed down one that is going to fit perfectly just underneath our scene. Again, I'm going to attach it with a strip of foam adhesive, and then that finishes our card. So we have lots of layers and dimensions on this beautiful card. I want to reiterate all the ways that we use Pawsitively velvet paper here. So I'm going to pull in my original 2 cards and recap all the ways that we use Pawsitively velvet paper today. So we stamped, we also ink blended, so that's super fun. Make sure to heat set. And then we also embossed, used Pawsitively velvet paper to add texture for hats and beards, as well as Copics. And then we also used it for grounding as snow on our 3rd card and used it as texture for foliage. I hope you're inspired to use Pawsitively velvet paper on your future craft projects. Thank you so much for spending a part of your day with me. I hope you enjoyed this video and have a wonderful day. Bye everyone.
Hi there, I'm Heidi, Simon's mama and founder at simonsaysstamp.com. Thank you so much for watching our video. If you like what you just saw, be sure to press the thumbs up and subscribe to see more great content.